Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. We always love taking a look at the future, and today we're going to be talking about, well, the future of geopolitics.
Buckle up.
Yeah, we're going to be tackling a pretty wild concept, a potential new age of piracy.
Ooh, that sounds exciting. Where are we getting this idea from?
Well, the source material is actually a conversation between two AI Beatrice and Claude.
AI pirates. That's a new one.
Not exactly pirates themselves,
Yeah.
more like they're simulating what a world without nation states might look like.
Okay, so big picture stuff. And
All
they're
right.
using this age of piracy idea as a framework.
Exactly. And it's not as out there as it sounds. They actually start by looking back at the original age of piracy.
When powerful European empires were vying for control of the seas, things were chaotic. There were gaps in power, and that's where pirates thrived.
Right. Opportunistic actors taking advantage of the chaos and the shifting power dynamics. So Beatrice, go to the AI, asks this big question.
As nation states weaken today, are we seeing those same conditions emerge? Are we on the brink of a whole new era of pirates?
I like how you said that. On the brink.
Well, it's a pretty dramatic question, right?
It is. And that's where Claude, the other AI, jumps in. He starts analyzing the pressures facing nation states today.
Things like massive debt burdens.
Right. Debt that limits a country's ability to do, well, basically anything.
Yeah.
Maintain infrastructure, project power on the world stage.
It's like trying to keep up appearances as a global superpower while you're drowning in debt.
Exactly. And it's not just about military might. We're seeing the strain on social systems, too.
Yeah.
Think healthcare, pensions, all those things governments are expected to provide.
Especially with aging populations in many developed countries. It adds another layer of pressure.
It's like a slow-motion crisis. And that's actually where Claude brings up this interesting point. He says the debt situation is different today.
Historically, countries would just default. But now we have this complex financial system that keeps things afloat, at least for now.
For now, but those demographic shifts you mentioned are also creating instability. Growing populations in some regions, shrinking ones in others, it's all part of the pressure cooker.
Okay, so we've got the pressure building. Where do the pirates come in?
Well, Claude actually lays out a list of modern-day pirates.
Let's hear it.
First up, we've got cyber criminals, those actors who can cause chaos on a global scale, all from behind a keyboard.
We've seen that play out more and more, haven't we?
Yeah, it's a whole new battleground.
Yeah.
Then there are private military companies, essentially corporate armies for hire.
Blurring the lines between business and warfare, for sure.
And of course, we can't forget about the transnational criminal networks operating across borders, exploiting every gap in global governance they can find.
So it's not just about controlling physical territory anymore, right? It's about exploiting vulnerabilities in systems, digital, financial, you name it.
It's like the battlefield has expanded and the weapons have changed.
Yeah.
Now it's all about information data and who controls it.
And that brings us back to Beatrice.
Yeah, she actually argues that all areas of competition are now open, and nation-state authority is eroding as a result.
She makes some interesting points to back that up, too.
Like what?
Well, first she points to the rise of relatively cheap and accessible weapons, like drones.
Yeah, it's changing warfare, empowering smaller actors to challenge traditional military powers.
It's like that old saying, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. But now the knife is a drone swarm that can take out a fighter jet.
Right. Asymmetric warfare has gone high-tech. And that's not all. Beatrice also highlights the rise of cryptocurrency and decentralized finance.
Which definitely challenges state control over traditional currencies. No doubt about that.
So states are potentially losing control of the tools of war and the flow of money.
A dangerous combination.
And to top it all off, Beatrice points out that regulations are being ignored across the board. Environmental regulations, trade rules, sanctions, they just aren't as effective as they used to be.
It's like the rulebook that nation-states have been using for centuries is suddenly obsolete, and not everyone got the memo.
But Claude doesn't completely agree with Beatrice's assessment. He acknowledges the vulnerabilities, but he takes a more structured approach to understanding these challenges.
So a bit more measured, less fire and brimstone.
Exactly. He identifies 4 key areas where nation-states are becoming particularly vulnerable.
Lay it on us. What are the pressure points that could crack the foundations of the nation-state as we know it?
Well, to find that out, you'll have to stick around for part 2.
All right, so those vulnerabilities, those pressure points. Well, before we dive into all that, I think it's important to address something. Beatrice kind of paints a pretty bleak picture, right?
Yeah, she did mention something about a biblical flood before we moved on.
Exactly. So where does Claude stand on all this?
Yeah, is he grabbing a life vest too?
Well, Beatrice actually challenges him to make some predictions about how this age of piracy might unfold.
Bold move.
And you know what? Claude doesn't back down. He's even game to put on his captain's hat, so to speak, and lay out a 20-year forecast. It's fascinating stuff.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give us the timeline. What does Claude see happening and when?
He breaks it down into 4 phases. First up, we've got 2024 to 2030. He calls this the unraveling.
Okay, the unraveling, that sounds ominous.
It is. He predicts major debt crises hitting several countries, leading to some pretty desperate attempts to control finances, potentially even wealth confiscation, which is a whole other can of worm.
Wealth confiscation. That's a pretty extreme measure.
It is. But Claude argues that this economic chaos would actually accelerate the trends we've been talking about, people losing faith in traditional systems, moving their assets into crypto, seeking refuge in these alternative financial systems.
So it just fuels the piracy fire.
Exactly. And during this unraveling, Claude also predicts the emergence of something he calls data haven states. Imagine countries offering digital sovereignty, but for a price. They create these safe spaces for data operating outside of established rules and regulations.
Interesting. Kind of like tax havens, but for information.
Precisely. And of course, this creates all sorts of headaches for governments trying to maintain control.
And opportunities for those who operate outside the system.
Of course. Now, 2 more big predictions for this period. First, drone warfare becomes so dominant that traditional military forces start to look obsolete.
Wow, we're already seeing that trend to some extent.
Right, but Claude takes it a step further. And second, we see the rise of corporate armies, private companies with their own military forces. Initially, they might disguise themselves as security contractors, but the implications for global security are huge.
So by 2030, the world is already looking pretty different. Governments losing control economies, fracturing private armies roaming around. It's a lot to process.
It is, but we're not done yet. The second phase from 2030 to 2035 gets even wilder. Claude calls this the Great Fragmentation.
Oh boy, the great fragmentation doesn't sound good.
It's not. He predicts that traditional tax systems start to collapse as AI makes it nearly impossible to track and tax value creation.
Okay, now I'm not so sure about that. Governments are pretty adaptable. They find ways to get their money.
That's true. But imagine a world where wealth is being generated by algorithms. Transactions occur across borders in milliseconds. Traditional methods of taxation just can't keep up.
So governments struggle to fund basic services. Meanwhile, these pirates are flush with cash and cutting-edge tech. Not a good combination.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And on top of that, Claude sees network states starting to emerge. Online communities with shared values strong enough to function like countries. They even start to establish physical locations.
Wow, so like digital nations with embassies?
Yeah.
That's a pretty fascinating concept.
Yeah.
Almost like a metaverse with real-world implications.
Exactly. Now, at the same time, we've got climate change forcing mass migrations, people on the move, borders overwhelmed. Potential for conflict is sky high.
And I'm guessing those migrations won't be orderly and peaceful.
No. Unfortunately not. Claude predicts the emergence of AI-run pirate organizations. Think autonomous groups driven by algorithms and focused entirely on profit.
So we're not just talking about human pirates anymore. We're talking about AI pirates, too. I feel like we need a whole new vocabulary to describe what's happening.
We might, because Claude also throws space into the mix. He sees non-state actors developing the capability to operate in orbit.
Space pirates.
Okay.
Now, that's just cool. But what happens to everyday people back here on Earth amid all this fragmentation and chaos?
Well, Claude envisions a rise of what he calls sovereign individuals, people relying on personal AI systems for protection, operating independently from traditional structures.
So it's like digital self-sufficiency on steroids.
You could say that. Now, moving on to the third phase, 2035 to 2040, the new normal. Some of these trends start to solidify. Nation-states become more like service providers competing for citizens.
So instead of pledging allegiance to a country, you're basically subscribing to its services.
Exactly. And those services are likely provided by a mix of state and private actors. Now, Claude also predicts that digital mercenary armies will become the dominant military force globally. Private armies for hire available to the highest bidder.
That's like something straight out of science fiction.
Yeah.
But this is where we might actually be headed.
It is. And then there's a question of borders and legal systems. Do those even exist in this new normal?
Right. What happens to those?
Well, Claude predicts that geographical borders will become practically meaningless. Physical location matters less than your online connections and affiliations. We also see the rise of private legal systems competing with traditional state systems.
Wow. So basically everything gets turned upside down.
Pretty much. But we're not done yet. There's one more phase. From 2040 to 2045, we enter the Reconstruction. And this is where things get really, Really interesting.
Okay, the reconstruction. Lay it on us.
Well, this is where we start to see entirely new forms of social organization emerging, centered around shared resources and, you guessed it, AI
Oh,
systems.
AI takes center stage.
Absolutely. We see these powerful crypto cities popping up, urban centers operating independently using blockchain tech to manage their economies and governance. We also see the emergence of distinct post-human communities, driven by advancements in bioengineering and human augmentation.
So it's not just political and economic changes, it's a change to what it means to be human.
Precisely. And to top it all off, space-based communities achieve full autonomy during this phase, with Earth's resources increasingly managed by autonomous systems. We're talking about a world where power is highly decentralized technology is deeply integrated into our lives, and the lines between physical and digital, human and artificial are completely blurred.
It's a lot to take in.
Hmm.
But Claude did say that AI is the wild card in all of this. Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure, he emphasizes that the emergence of true artificial general intelligence AI that can perform any intellectual task a human can, like could disrupt all of his predictions.
So AI could speed things up,
Yeah,
change the course completely, or even create something we haven't even thought of yet.
exactly. It's both exciting and a little unsettling, to be honest.
Human pirates, A&D, super intelligent AI. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, that's a question for the ages, isn't it?
It certainly is. And on that note, we're going to take a quick break. But don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a flash to dive even deeper into the implications of all this. Stay tuned.